Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler, still suffering as I know so many other people are from this devastating loss that we've suffered in this year's election. It's a devastating loss for the forces of democracy, not just in America, but around the world. It's a loss for democratic Ukraine trying to resist the fascist invader from Russia. It's a loss for the better angels of Israel's nature in trying to shake off the misfortune of having a fascist group in power at a crucial time, making terrible mistakes of a destructive nature. It's a loss probably for the forces of democracy in Europe, or at least it's a danger. I won't go into how that work. I don't really know, but there are contagions in this world, and there's also a need for countries to protect themselves. And if Donald Trump is president of the United States, their main protector over the past since World War II is now no longer a reliable protector, at least if the past is any guide, if Donald Trump's words are any indication. He wasn't willing to say he hoped that Ukraine would win. He was the one who said about NATO that, if they don't pay up, you know what I'm talking about. But we're talking about democracy here, and it is democracy as it now exists in the world that has suffered a defeat. And the root of democracy is it is ruled by the people, demos in Greek. So democracy as a force depends upon the people. And what has just happened now in this election, in which a presidential candidate who was like unimaginably bad, and a political party that is entirely morally bankrupt, demonstrably, have been given by the American people, even the popular vote, this victory. And so clearly something is wrong. I mean, if you asked any group to design a political force that more clearly should be rejected, I don't know how you would. I mean, I suppose you could have brown shirts beating people up on the streets, not just January 6th, but this is really pretty extreme. Donald Trump as the criminal, Donald Trump as the guy who doesn't care about anything but himself, Donald Trump as a habitual liar and bully. You could just go on and say, what else is missing? I mean, he doesn't seem to be murderous. That's the main distinction. I've been looking for years at, how is this guy Hitler? I mean, a lot of similarities, but one way in which they're different is that Hitler seemed to have a desire or a need to kill people, whereas Trump only has a need to humiliate them. It's better, but it's the same ugly impulse. So here we have a guy who it would have been hard to design somebody less appropriate to give presidency to than Donald Trump. And that's only become more and more evident as he's become. So what does it mean that the American people went to the polls and more of them than not, voted for this thing, which I would say pretty clearly, if you were to get some big city's telephone directory or any rural area's telephone directory and draw names at random. And the question was, how many names would you have to draw before you got to somebody who was, from the evidence, likely to be more destructive than, if given the powers of the presidency, than Donald Trump? I think it would be a fairly high number. I mean, I would very happily draw a name randomly out of the country and give that person the presidency instead of Donald Trump. Because I don't think there are very many people, and it's not like it's not clear. I mean, everybody who's paying attention has to know a lot of things about Donald Trump that should be automatic disqualifiers. A guy you can't believe anything he says? Oh, no, you don't want a president like that. A guy that put his own political interests ahead of protecting the country when we had a once-in-a-century pandemic? Oh, no. The guy who sold out American national security interests the way he went after Zelensky in that first impeachment set of crimes in order to serve his own political purposes, while not only breaking the law because Congress had passed that money that he was using to blackmail Zelensky with, but also helping the powers of Putin, who was the greatest adversary to the United States, the one with the most naked hostility to us, attempting to bring us down, which is why we also got to look at the fact that our greatest enemy wanted him to be president in 2016. I mean, there's nothing subtle or hidden about this picture. And yet, more than half the American people went and voted for him. So it's appropriate to ask, as is happening, as Democrats are doing, because a blame game is going on, and it's certainly appropriate for the forces of democracy, which at this point in the power system of this country is not both major parties, but it has to be the Democratic Party. It should ask itself, how come it lost this battle when everything was right out there? And if rule by the people is appropriate, you would expect that almost everybody would see, oh, got to vote against this. I mean, I would have voted happily for Biden, even if I thought he was getting senile, because he's a decent guy. Somebody I read said, I'd vote for Joe Biden even if he were dead. And I agreed with that, because it is so clear that if you believe in democracy, if you believe in having a government that acts as an instrument of the people, for the people, because by the people, it was just simply essential, not that Kamala Harris be elected, but that Donald Trump be kept away from the powers of the presidency. Hardly anything in our world is clearer than that. And yet, the American electorate voted more for him than to reject him. So why did democracy suffer this devastating defeat? It's got something to do with the people. Yeah, the Democrats should be asking themselves, how can we fight more effectively? But I would like to call attention to something about the people that should inform a part of what the nature of the challenge is. There are a lot of things that can be said. I'm not overly impressed with the theories that are put forward because it's so unclear exactly what has happened in this election that there's nobody that really knows how that happened. I mean, there are lots and lots of questions. I mean, for example, I heard many times in the last week or so that the people who are deciding late were going to Harris. And then after the election, I hear about this last minute Trump surge. Well, how did that happen? I mean, what's that about? So, there's just lots of questions and nobody knows. And I certainly don't know, though I've been looking at this stuff hard for a long time. But here's a factual thing. And I think that it might be good to have this as at least one starting place as we ask ourselves, what went wrong? Well, one thing that went wrong is that if you looked at the exit polls, you'd find out that the economy was a major issue for a lot of people. And when I saw in the Chiron on MSNBC, before the polls closed, asking Florida voters what issues were most important to them. And I think the same basic thing was done also with Georgia. The issue that came up as the leading issue was the economy. So I knew enough to know that if the economy was motivating a lot of people, that was bad for Kamala Harris and good for Trump. I know that because I knew that because I've been following what Paul Krugman has been saying for maybe a year and a half, which is there's this huge gap between the actual state of the American economy and what people think is the state of the American economy. He kept on calling attention to it in one piece after another. And I don't think he ventured a theory about exactly why that was. If he did, I've forgotten it. But he kept on remarking upon it. And indeed, we had reason to know that Americans had been unhappy about the economy. There's a disjoint that Krugman observed between the reality and what people believe. And here's an example, which I choose because it's sort of incontrovertible, that it points to something about the knowledge or consciousness of the people that proved maybe disastrous for the forces of democracy, that something wrong with the demos. Now, isn't there something wrong with the demos if the following things are true? During the presidency of Joe Biden, we've had more sustained job growth, more than 15 million new jobs. The first president, I think, in history to have, so many consecutive months of job growth, and have an economy that's been growing compared to all the other economies in the world that are sort of like ours, the advanced industrial democracies. The Economist comes out with a recent cover, the envy of the world. We're talking about the American economy. So we've got this record of sort of almost dazzling achievement. Add to it that we did have a problem of inflation, which, by the way, was essentially a global problem, not a specifically American problem. But we have gotten out of it with another major achievement, which is a soft landing, meaning that inflation has been tamed. We're back down around 2%, which was the Fed's target, down from whatever it was at the peak, 7 or 8. And the inflation was due, I gather, almost entirely to the lingering economic consequences of the pandemic and the need to sort of right things that had gotten out of balance, which is why it was global, because other countries were having to deal with the same thing. So here we got this economy that's the envy of the world. It's on fire in a way. It achieved things that most economists said were impossible to achieve, and it maintained a very low level of unemployment, which you would think it would be the case with 15 million jobs being created. Quite a performance, and yet the American people are saying that in general, that the economy is in bad shape. And specifically, I believe these statistics are right. The polls showed that only something like 18% of Americans, registered voters, I don't know what their population was, but Americans, about only less than a fifth of Americans recognized that during these last 4 years, we've had remarkably good, or even positive, let's just say, positive job growth. The reality is it's been sort of record-setting in that respect, but only 18% think there's been any job growth, and 4/5 of the people think that at best we are stagnant, and a big chunk of them actually think that we've been losing jobs. So clear reality, a belief in a false picture of reality, and then they go and vote on the basis of the economy, and fascism wins the battle. Whatever needs to be done, it's going to have to address a lot of things about the people. But maybe a way into a piece of it is to ask, why was it that when Election Day came around, only a fifth of the people understood a fundamental factual truth about the economy? How did that happen? And then what would have to change for that to be otherwise? And part of the answer for the Democratic Party is probably to say, well, what could we have done differently that would have resulted in that being different? So that people went to the polls understanding that they, as Americans, under the stewardship of this administration, it wasn't that they, what would have to be different? What would we have had to say to people? Or in what way would we, or what kind of ads? But that ain't the whole thing. There's also the picture of how did it happen, and what is it that we're really up against? And what we're up against is something that I think has to do with battling for the hearts and minds of the American people. And some people are pointing toward the need for messaging and getting a media system that can be as powerful as the right wing's media system. I may have some thoughts about that, because talk radio to counter what's his name, Rush Limbaugh, was my main occupation, in a sense, for 10 years, from 1992 to 2002. So I thought a lot about what can you create that would be that would counter what's happening. I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about how the Democratic Party at that time seemed to me to make a mistake that was exemplified by talk radio gatekeepers of a large nature that I was dealing with, who said things like, Rush Limbaugh's audience is not our concern. But anyway, I saw on Bulwark that messaging is really important. One of the fellows, I think it's JVL, who was talking about how the picture that that the American people had little to do with their actual experienced reality, but was the result of they were being fed lies and lies and lies, and the picture that the right-wing media like Fox News and Rush Limbaugh before them, that picture was more real in their minds than the reality that they were actually experiencing. Did people actually walk around in America thinking that this was the American carnage? I mean, there were pictures sold. And how do you counter that? This isn't a country where murder is on the rise. The immigrant communities are not full of rapists and criminals. They have this picture of criminality being essentially synonymous with immigrants, but there are facts. Why are facts been so impotent in the face of these lies? So I think we can look at that particular fact that we had huge job creation and 4/5 of the people didn't know it when they went to vote. Well, what's the problem there? And the problem goes, I'm afraid it really goes very, very deep, that the American people, a good chunk of them, have developed a certain kind of consciousness where you could sell people on things that their experience should tell them are not true. Apparently, people on these roundtables are saying people know what it feels like when they go to when it's hard to pay the bills. Well, is it really harder to pay the bills now? I've understood that that wage growth, especially at the bottom, exceeded what was lost to inflation, which would imply that paying the bills might be not fun in 2024, but doesn't it mean that it would be at least no worse than it was in 2019 and maybe better than 2020 with the pandemic? So why are people feeling so disgruntled? Is it because they have been led into an alternate reality? I think that's a big piece of it. And the Democratic Party needs to ask, how did that happen? And what can we do now to fight to bring them back to the real reality? We don't want, if we believe in democracy, for people to go to and vote on at the polls on the basis of a false picture of the economy, a false picture of the consequences of immigration. And then there's all the ways in which what voting for Trump voted for goes way beyond any of these issues. I mean, it's voting for destructiveness in all the forms the 7 deadly sins, from greed to lust. He bilks people out of greed, and then he violates women out of lust of a sexual nature and the lust for power. I mean, he's a one-man crime wave. How did people see him when they went to vote? Where my sense of where the election was going failed was that I had faith in the American people that it was only a smaller section that had really been led into darkness, sufficient that they could look at Donald Trump and think he's the good guy. I don't. And what happened on election day was there were those people, and then there were the people who could look at Donald Trump and not see that he was simply so unacceptable. We would take any, a random dozen out of the Manhattan telephone directory, confident we wouldn't come up with anything that the people out there on Mount Rushmore would be more concerned about keeping out of the powers of the presidency. If we want to be pro-democracy, we've got to attend to the fact that obviously we have now learned that the viability of democracy depends upon the consciousness of the people. Our founders recognized that in their own kind of language. They talked about Republican virtue. And I've not ever gotten a really good historian's understanding of all the ways in which they conceived that. But basically, they understood that a democracy was going to be healthy only if the people had certain virtues, anyway, that would make them make the right decisions. Well, the American people just made a profoundly wrong decision. I don't know exactly how we look at what happened to a Republican virtue, but there's a good reason to be looking deeply into what happened to the American people that so many, enough to win the presidency, even in the popular vote, would vote for a guy so obviously wrong from the point of view of any of our democratic values, including the rule of law, including the consent of the governed. So what went wrong? Well, there are ways in which the Democratic Party got beat in the fight for the hearts and minds and the kind of picture of reality that occupied the vision of the people. I mean, human understanding is the foundation of the democratic ethos. Decent people with a decent understanding making reasonably good decisions. But something's gone wrong. And while part of the issue is, well, how should the Democratic Party fight this fight? Part of the issue is looking outside of that framework at what happened to the American people that this was possible. And then the challenge is, how can they be brought back? We're not going back. There was a piece of it always that bothered me, because in my mind, part of what I wanted out of our politics is for us to go back, not to the oppression of women or people of color. No, not back in that sense. But I grew up in an America where essentially there was a decent government functioning in a decent way and achieving reasonably good outcomes in most respects. And democracy was working. And what's happened since, the idea that 4/5 of the American people, after all of this job creation, wouldn't know it. Thought that the American people understood things, at least to that extent. Maybe it's a little more sophisticated to ask them to understand how we compare with other economies, or to be able to make the connection. Maybe that's asking too much, that you have a pandemic, you get these supply chain issues, so of course you're going to get inflation. That's just part of the price that we've had to pay because a virus spread across the planet and it killed over 1 million Americans, or whatever we're up to. No small thing, and it had economic repercussions, and one of them was inflation. Is that asking too much? Well, at least you should know that the economy isn't terrible. Yeah, but then there's, but people know what they feel about paying the bills. And we talked about that a little bit. But also, I understood from what Paul Krugman was reporting maybe a year ago, that if you ask people about the condition of the economy, they think it's terrible. And you ask people about their own financial situation and even the economy in their region, the things that they see with their own eyes and they experience, they say it's okay. But there you got it again. Their lived experience, the reality, had proved impotent to overcome the story that they were being told, that the economy was terrible. The force of fascism has managed to corrupt the consciousness of a great many Americans in a whole variety of ways, and that must be addressed. We need the demos to be more worthy or more capable, more competent to see what's in front of their eyes, to understand things, to apply their basic values of decency and the fundamental values of our founding, to hold them in sufficient reverence that they can apply them to the picture around them and make decent choices rather than vote for Donald Trump and a Republican Party that have clearly become forces of fascism. Thank you. I'm going to probably try to move away from the immediate political, partly because it hurts too much to look at, and partly because my main mission actually is at a bigger picture. This whole battle that we just lost fits into that picture. But what I really want to get across in the years that I have left is that there is an understanding to be had of what it means to be a civilization-creating creature. In other words, going back 10, 12,000 years and looking at a particular juncture in the human story and seeing that it has implications that have profound ramifications. And I've been developing that. Please go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, if you're interested in that right now. But I've got a new way of presenting it in a way, which has got to do with a series of inevitabilities that this battle that we just lost is part of a battle that's been going on in various forms since the rise of civilization, for reasons that I show in that book, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution. There I point to a particular inevitability, which I feel like is pretty much ironclad, and it explains that what we're dealing with is a force of brokenness that inevitably arises with civilization. That inevitability, I feel. But what I've lately been thinking, and I will be producing a series and publishing here, I hope you will check it out, is that there's a fundamental sense in which you can show step by step that the situation that we're in as a species right now, which could be described as it's unclear whether we're going to be able to survive for the long haul on this planet with our civilization, or whether because of the destructive forces at work in our civilization, we're going to destroy ourselves before we get it together. That I think that I can show that this is probably we've enacted and we are a pattern, and we find ourselves in a situation which has probably been enacted around the cosmos in much the same way on a whole multitude of planets in a whole multitude of galaxies. And there's only the one that I'm going to really claim is inevitable. But I'll make a case that there are a variety of steps, each one of which is, if not inevitable, then maybe highly likely, the emergence of life. Life's having a component whose strategy is based on the use of intelligence and therefore the selection for ever greater intelligence. And then the next step for that selection for intelligence ultimately inevitably leading to some species that starts investing in culture, which is the adaptive form that makes use of intelligence. And then it being inevitable, once a creature starts developing culture, it's pretty much inevitable that eventually they're going to get to the point that they step out onto the path of civilization by extricating themselves from the niche in which they evolved biologically by inventing their own new way of life. And then there are some things that follow from that illuminate where we are, that we, in the nature of the challenge that we face, that any species that it creates a civilization would have to face. And I do believe that this all hangs together fairly well. And I hope that you'll follow me along in this series where in 10 minutes or less for each step, I talk about how what's happened that leads to us being right here can be seen in this way, which enables us to see that, oh, we may not know about anybody else, any other species on any other planet that stepped onto our kind of civilization creating path. But we can pretty well say what that whole story of that species might look like that would be very strongly resemble the human story to this point. And understanding all that would enable us to do a better job in letting the forces that are sort of life-serving, that get selected for because they help perpetuate life, get those forces to be able to overcome the life-destroying forces that the rise of civilization inevitably entailed. And that ramify through history in such a way that you can produce something as broken and ugly as this Trumpian Republican Party and Donald Trump as president of the United States and the other forms of fascism that have been rising in power around the world that still must be defeated. Even for human civilization, or for our kind, for our children and grandchildren to survive. The stock market's gone up in the wake of this election, but the chances for long-term human survival have gone down. So please follow this particular new way I'm enjoying of laying out the story. I think you'll find it worth your while, and I am passionate about wanting to convey it to people. It's my unachieved life's mission, and I'm 78 and I don't have a lot of time to achieve it.